this three-zoned articulation of the necropolitical power knowledge as a killing mechanism, I argue that the first zone is the zone of commodification, and here necropower inflicts social deaths onto people. Here the power knowledge is the very neoliberal logic of homo economicus that Foucault himself had criticized back in his theorization of biopolitics. We can think of homo economicus as a funnel where the rich human social experiences and their textures is funneled through this narrative to become pure numbers and equations, and then turns life into what Agamben had called bare life in 1998. Homo economics as a power knowledge argues and requires a person to consistently think and act rationally and to be narrowly self-interested. This is to say that passion is discouraged, and to help people is discouraged, because you should be only choosing your own benefit. In an analogy, I argue that this is to ask John Olsen to paint exactly like Pierre Mondrian. This is not to say Pierre Mondrian's painting is inferior, but to say reduce the rich textuality of John Olsen to a different technique, a different philosophy of painting. That is not fair, and that is not okay. So in the extreme articulation of homo economicus, life is rendered into a consistent cost analysis benefit. On the left-hand side of the scale, we have the utility costing side, which is unemployment, homelessness, diseases and illness, and fatality. And on the right-hand side of this cost-benefit analysis, we have the utility adding side, which is treatable knowledge and skills, which argues that a person's knowledge and skill is only invaluable if you can monetize it. The second one is intention and happiness. In this neoliberal scheme, attention and happiness is valued. This is because a focused and happy person is way more productive than one that is not. And then the third, we have the complete and utter equation of self-value and productivity, which is to say, if you're not a socially productive person, you don't have any value. And the narrative of homo economicus requires any person to be consistently able to choose everything on the right-hand side over everything that is on the left-hand side. But in reality, we know that this is not possible, and this is not fair, because certain people are more prone to life, to external circumstances, to realities that send them to the zone of unemployment, homelessness, diseases, and eventually could potentially kill them. So the problem with homo economicus is not that a person should be rational or a person should be self-interested. It is that it does not account for external circumstances when people are not able to choose the utility adding side over the utility costing side. In other words, homo economicus does not account for life and shits that just happen. Here we can think of Maslow's hierarchy. Under homo economicus, it is essentially saying that you should be able to choose a knowledge, a skill that should be able to provide you with food, with accommodation, with safety, with rest. And it is not the government's responsibility to do that. Therefore, this narrative is effectively transferring the burden of life that a person carries, that under the Western ideology of social contract should be able to share between a person, a community, and a government, transferring all this burden back onto the person themselves. Therefore, no one else is responsible for you other than yourself. You are the sole proprietor and administrator of your own life. Under this extreme expression of homo economicus, a person's social experiences is void of its meaning. It becomes an economic experience, and strictly and narrowly so. Therefore, a person is transgressed into a thing. A person, humanity, and social interactions and social experiences in education, work relating to a group, it is void of any meaning other than the economic meaning. And when your life is void of meaning, you become a commodity, you become a thing, and you die a social death. A social death is extremely concerning because it leads to the second stage of the necropolitical killing, which is the material or the literal death in the zone of abandonment. I argue that this is because a person cannot be abandoned, but a thing can. So when a person is being transgressed, it's being commodified into a thing. This thing can then be abandoned in social policies without any consequences. Under the zone of abandonment, governments and sovereignties are able to use homo economicus to underpin its social policies in the sense that any people who die as the result of a lack of social support and social welfare can simply be reconfigured and chalked up to the cost of the society functioning. In other words, humans are not treated as human anymore. They're being treated as just part of the cost-benefit analysis. This is theorized in different languages and terminologies by Agamben as bare life and as by Laura Berlant as a slow death. As in when you don't interfere with the death, certain population die a slow death, and sovereignty is just responsible for the death as if they had killed these populations themselves. Another example of slow death or letting die would be queer death. In Eric Stanley's theorization of queer death as a assassin of the other, he theorizes that there are three different layers of the necro powers killing of queer deaths. First, there are existing violence directed against at queerness, but there is that's the first layer, the existing layer of violence and death. The second layer is a narrative and a rhetoric perpetuated by the mainstream society that these deaths are individual events, they're emotionally fueled, as in there is no systematical or institutionalized inequality between queer and non-queer population, as in any queer bashing, queer killing is entirely individualistic, and the society bear no responsibility towards these deaths. And the first and the second layer of social violence against queer population is combined with Homo economicus 2.0, where the queer life, that is sexually non-productive, is perceived as irrational. Therefore, queerness is rendered a non-identity. When these three layers of violence are combined, there is this perception of queerness as non-identity. Therefore, queer is nothing. Therefore, to kill nothing is not nothing. So Eric Stanley is arguing that by allowing the social violence against queer population and then narrating this violence as individual and emotionally fueled, and then rendering queer identity as a non-identity, the sovereignty is essentially handing a loaded gun into a non-queer basher and a non-queer murderer. Therefore, it is as good as having killed queer population themselves. The most explicit example of social abandonment leading to massive material and literal death is exemplified in migrant worker deaths, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that migrant workers had always been treated unfairly without a social network, without social safety net. However, during the COVID pandemic, almost all liberal democratic government had abandoned migrant workers through a global pandemic as a state of exception or state of emergency, in the Agamben sense, in the sense that during the pandemic, migrant workers are left to die on their own because the governments refused to assist them in medical treatments, to assist of them in living, accommodation, or even go back to their own homes and countries. And this have led migrant workers around the world in different countries during COVID-19 to die in mass. Here I argue that by denying medical assistance, by denying legal wages, by denying any normative human rights-based claims, these sovereignties are essentially denying migrant workers of their rights to be a human. And this is the real state of exception there, that this extreme commodification of migrant workers, as in they are only seen as a product, as a commodity, effectively allows sovereignty to express its own power as the ability to actually change the ontic categories of migrant worker from the status of a human to the status of a thing. So the precarious everyday life, by precarious everyday life here we invoke the sense of Judith Butler's precarious life. The precarious everyday life of a migrant worker is three-layered. First, they're led to die by the denial of medical and financial assistance, especially during a global pandemic. And then the precarious everyday life, as in they could die of exhaustion, they could die of lack of accommodation and homelessness. They're led to die on their own just by wearing out of the population. And third, in his De Leon's book Soldiers and Kings, he theorized this displaced or capital punishment under a different means of deportation, where migrant workers, especially undocumented migrant workers, after they have engaged in the US economy, are deliberately deported to known human smugglers who are after these migrant workers, or corrupted police who are after these migrant workers. Here, De Leon theorizes this deportation as a capital punishment carried out in different means. And here, the homo economicus that was an economic theory here underpins social theories and policies, and that effectively give the government moral and legal plausibility to leave a certain undesirable population to die without actively trying to interfere with their death. It effectively brings forward their fated death, or just wear them out, let them die. So here the death is literal. People actually die the death. And here I want to point out to the deliberate letting out of population is selective, is discriminatory. It is not universal. And the third zone of the necropolitics killing zone is zone of ontological capture. Here it is in the death space through, ironically, what is called the death care industry. And here the ethos that is foreign to the neoliberal ethos die a cultural or symbolic death. And I will get to what this ethos is in a moment. First, we need to talk about funeral capitalism. It is the commodification of bereavement. Funeral and funeral rites and mourning is commodified and being sold. It is evident in funeral poverty that families routinely suffer financially as the result of having held a funeral for their loved ones. This is almost Charles Dickens in a sense. We also have, and then the government is saying that, well, if you want to avoid funeral poverty, you should have bought a funeral insurance for yourself. And what if a person actually cannot afford a funeral or have not bought a funeral insurance because they struggled to put food on the table? In theory, a state-paid funeral with a very simple rites, a very funeral casket, and is available, but these state-paid funerals are effectively not accessible in Australia, the US, the UK, because the process is long, humiliating to get to there. There is a research conducted by Foster and Woodthorpe saying that the US government actually have a dedicated state funeral fund, but that funeral fund is not used. The funding, only about 30% of the funding was actually used because people are not aware of the funding, or in their extreme sadness, they're too overwhelmed to apply for this funding. And then we have a cultural hegemony in the death care industry, which is to say that unless you are a Christian, unless you have money, you don't get to die a satisfying death. You don't get to get the eschatology that is appropriate to you and that is satisfying, that gives you a satisfied death. In other words, you don't get to remembered unless you are a Christian. In practice, this looks like a Buddhist cannot get the week-long vigil they have home because it is a public health violation. Muslims, especially in very crowded cities such as New York, London, and Sydney, do not get to go to an Islamic cemetery that can facilitate a certain requirement of their funeral because they're running out of space. And religious death rites, for example, having a religious leader to the funeral and held these rites, are not accessible outside of these indigenous places. For example, in Australia, if you live outside of Sydney and Melbourne, it is extremely hard to get a non-Christian funeral. And in linguistic and cultural diverse places, here research points out at Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and Quebec. Not only your choice is limited, if you do want a funeral director who speaks your language and can give you some resemblance of eschatologically appropriate death rites, you have to pay a premium for it. This is effectively to say that no one is deserved of a good afterlife unless you are an English-speaking middle-class Christian. And no one's life is harder than Indigenous people in the death space. Here I theorize an Indigenous ungrievability, but again borrowing Judith Butler's concept of ungrievability. But I have a slight twist on that. Here I'm not saying that their life is rendered as non-grievable. I'm saying there is literally no way for Indigenous, especially Indigenous or Australians, to grieve their loss. First, some Indigenous rites, such as hanging a person in a tree or leaving the dead body in the open air on a funeral pyre, is now a public health violation. Indigenous people are also losing access to consecrated lands where they're turned into parking lots or shopping malls, or made into national parks where it is you need a special permit to access. And then some Indigenous people have actually lost the physical remains of their ancestors. This is because during the development, their ancestors' body were dug up, and instead of treating them with care or returning them to First Nation Australians, they were either chucked out or just buried in not buried, just piled up in an archive somewhere. And some Indigenous people's graves theoretically exist in record on paper, but not in reality. In our own Dr. Wayne Appleby's 2025 essay, he talked about how he went to visit his grandfather's grave, which was in the planning paper. There was a map of the cemetery saying grandfather Appleby's grave was at a certain location, but it did not exist in reality. So here the Indigenous ungrievability is characterized by the Indigenous people having no way to die, nowhere to die, and no one to die to. And here, the homo economicus is nominalized in market practice, as in the government has no interest or intention to make sure that after people die, their ethos are cared properly. It is therefore constructing a choice-limited marketplace in the death care industry deliberately. It is saying, well, you're not getting your desired funeral rights, too bad. That is just market behavior. And here what is being captured is the diverse ontologies of death. In other words, unless you are a Christian, you're white, you're middle class, you don't get to die. And remember, by the way, you want to be remembered. And effectively, this is inflicting a cultural death or a spiritual death onto those cultures that are, or onto those ethos, those are not Christian, not white, not middle class. So to summarize, necropolitics, I theorize there are threefold killing, and it is encapsulated in three different zones. First, in the zone of commodification, the necropolitical power knowledge of homo economicus inflicts a social death onto everyone. This is because when your social experience is funneled through the narrative of homo economicus, it is void of texture, void of humanity. It becomes an strict economic behavior. Therefore, a person is socially dead and turned into a product. Secondly, in the zone of abandonment, certain population die a material death prematurely. This is because the necropolitical power knowledge of homo economicus becomes embedded into social policies where it becomes justifiable and morally plausible for sovereignties to stop providing social safety net to a certain population and effectively wear out this population or watch and let this population die. In the third zone of ontological capture, this deliberately choice-limited marketplace of death care industry captures the ontologies of death and then effectively not letting the other ethos to live on. And here's my reference list. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope you have a good day.